So now we're talking about the structures and weaknesses of the Artists Confederation. In part, it's going to be mostly an institutional analysis. It's what political scientists do. The institutions create the rules of the game and create the way the dynamics are going to work out. The other thing I'll point out is that when we talk about the powers and the structure of government, we're also talking about the weaknesses. So in many ways, the Artists Confederation, despite its term, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, set into motion something that wasn't going to last very long. Issues with the structure and the powers in the Artists Confederation that needed to be solved. But because the institutions wouldn't allow even minor modifications, a different approach needed to be done. And so the entire document needed to be changed. And so let's talk a little bit about the structure and weaknesses of the Artists Confederation. So as we talked about, the fundamental unit in the Artists Confederation is that each state would be able to control their own destiny. And so in order to allow that to happen, you made sure you could have that happen by having each state had one vote, despite their population. It didn't matter whether you were the largest state in the Union, like it was Virginia at the time, or one of the smaller ones, like New Jersey or Rhode Island. Each state had one, and that would allow each state to have an equal voice in the institution, the legislature, the representative legislature that would make decisions on behalf of the system. So it also said that the individuals who were responsible for hiring and firing the representatives, they were not elected by the people of the state. It was instead the state legislatures who hired and fired the representatives in the National Congress under the Artists Confederation. And that meant that those representatives would fight for the state's interests, regardless of what the impact would be for the entire country or even the individuals who were in their state. Again, we had talked about the idea that the idea of states' rights is that states are better understand their state's needs and their people, but the state legislature is not the same thing as the people of the state. And if the state legislature wants a particular thing, people for hiring and firing the national representatives in the Artists Confederation, the national representatives would really pay attention to the interests of the state governments. And so the state governments were the foundation of the Artists Confederation. In addition to that, you had the requirement that to pass any law, any national law, anything the national government was going to do, took 9 of 13 states. That is more than the 7 that is not needed mathematically for a simple majority. It was a supermajority of 9 of 13, but it also meant that 5 states could stop anything from going forward. And if you could find those 5 states, which they could relatively easily, the national government couldn't do all that much. They were sort of hamstrung because of the fundamental rule that you needed 9 of 13 to pass any laws. Furthermore, to change the Artists Confederation, to change the founding document, it took unanimity. It took all 30 states to agree. And that's virtually impossible. And so the document couldn't be changed to correct any mistakes, even small ones. So in part, the voting rules made it hard for the national government to do anything, and it made it hard to make any changes to that system because it took unanimity in order to change the fundamental structure under the Artists Confederation. Another thing that's there, and when I say these words, I know that people don't really pay attention or kind of get bored, but the national government didn't have the power to tax under the Artists Confederation. And the power to tax is really important. It's the ability to raise money, and then the national government can use that money to do the things that it's tasked to do or would like to do. And so the power to tax was not given to the national government. Instead, it was basically a donation system. And so states, we'll see in the Shays Rebellion, we'll see this, is that they'll say, no, I don't feel like contributing because I don't really see the interests of North Carolina or Georgia or something like this in this particular issue, so we're not going to pay for it. And without pooling those resources, the national government wasn't able to do a lot. So even if the national government was able to pass a law of 9 of 13 states would agree to it, there might not be the funding that's necessary to do whatever they had said they were going to do. The other thing is that there was no precedent concern, we're going to see that even with the US Constitution, that we didn't want to make the mistake of what Britain had. We didn't want to have an American king with the Revolutionary War replace a British king with an American king. There is one exception to that. That one exception is Alexander Hamilton. He thought there should be an American king. But most of the other people at that time were saying, we don't want to have a monarchy. We don't want to have an American king. And so the rules were set up in such a way as who could speak for the entire country. But there are times when you need to have, particularly in a national crisis, you need to have someone who can speak for the larger nation. And without that, it made it hard for negotiations with foreign powers. It made it hard to move quickly, because in a crisis, sometimes you have to move quickly, and you need to have perhaps someone like a president to be able to do that. And so those are the fundamental powers in the structure of government. A lot of it had to do with the fundamental decision that they wanted the states to be in charge of their own destinies as much as possible. And so then it led to a number of institutional changes, so that the Arts Confederation almost immediately wasn't going to be sufficient. You couldn't create a national economy. You couldn't have a way to negotiate the complicated international political situation that was going on. Britain wanted us back. France and Spain didn't want to necessarily trade with us until we paid off some of the debts that accumulated during the Revolutionary War. All of this meant that the national government wasn't really able to do that much. And the state governments on their own weren't always able to do those things independently. Okay. And so what I want to do is to talk about one of the illustrations of the weaknesses of the Artists' Confederation. It's called Shays' Rebellion. And so I have on the slide some background information about Shays' Rebellion, and I have a link to a History Channel site that talks a little bit about Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion is an interesting case that is worth studying, and you can just take a look at that to get a little bit more information than we can provide here. But the idea of Shays' Rebellion is that during the Revolutionary War, or actually, let's talk about Shays' Rebellion a bit, and then we'll go back and talk about the background. So in the winter of 1786 to 1787, Daniel Shays, who was a colonel during the Revolutionary War, worked with George Washington, who was a big hero at that time, and so Daniel Shays was considered a hero. Daniel Shays of Western Massachusetts led a group of farmers in Western Massachusetts to stop the judges from foreclosing on due to unpaid property taxes. And so what happened was, during the Revolutionary War, as we saw in the Schoolhouse Rocks, when you saw the idea of the Minutemen, is that people across the country would their plows, would put down their tools, and go join the Revolutionary War to help fight on the side of for the Revolutionary War. And so for their sacrifice, the state governments would say that during that period of time, during the Revolutionary War, you wouldn't have to pay taxes on your lands while you were sacrificing for your country. And so that was the deal that was made. And so in the winter of 1786 and 1787, Daniel Shays started to rally individuals because the state of Massachusetts had actually broken its deal. The state of Massachusetts needed to have money to be able to pay off the debts to France and Spain, so the merchants and the bankers in Boston, Massachusetts, would be able to have trade. Because the national government couldn't come together and actually pay off the debts that accumulated to France and Spain, some of the states were doing it on their own. And in order to do that, they needed to raise money. And so they raised money by saying, oh, we're going to collect these back taxes that are owed to the state, and these individuals should recognize the benefits that this will provide. This will now allow Massachusetts to trade. That trade will create economic activity. That economic activity will make everyone better off. But what happened is those back taxes were considerable. The amount of money that farmers would have to pay. And if you've ever been to Western Massachusetts, you would see that, in fact, the soil is not all that conducive to growing things other than rocks, and people don't like eating rocks. So it was hard to come up with extra money. And so if you couldn't pay your taxes, then the government would come in and foreclose on your land. Or if you decided to pay your taxes, but then you couldn't pay the rent that you owed on your land, the banks would come in. So in either case, there were as many as 1/3 of all adult males in Western Massachusetts, 1/3 of them were facing foreclosure. So Daniel Shays, as a war hero, was trying to rally people and said, look, the way to stop that is so that if the judges come to town and try to foreclose, if the judges aren't allowed to have that hearing, then your lands won't be taken away from you. And so people joined him and joined in that protest. And so from the viewpoint of the Shays' Rebellion, this was the fundamental idea of there was no taxation without representation. The people of Western Massachusetts had been promised certain things, and in the Massachusetts legislature, they didn't really pay attention to the one representative from Western Mass economic power, Massachusetts at that time. And so the concern was that they felt that they were actually legitimate in protesting these things. On the other hand, the people in Boston, the merchants, the lawyers, the business owners, and the government thought of Shays' rebellion as breaking the rule of law, as fundamentally breaking the rule of law. And so on both sides, you had this concern, this righteous indignation on both sides. You had from the farmers the viewpoint that they were actually legitimate in their complaints, that the promise had been made to them that they wouldn't have to pay these back taxes, and suddenly they did. And so it was a form of no taxation without representation, the reason we fought the Revolutionary War in the first place. And then you had governments, particularly in Boston and the areas around there, they were looking at this as a fundamental breaking of the rule of law. You're not supposed to hold judges hostage. That's not how the rule of law works. And so it led to this rebellion of 1786 to 1787. So in the next, a little bit about what lessons were learned, because there are some larger lessons that were learned by the framers of the U.S. Constitution from this event.